Welcome to Talking with Tatchell. Hitler may have lost the war, but Germans are still on the throne of Britain. Is monarchy compatible with democracy? Regardless of their heritage, the Windsors are now part of our life. But they exercise powers that are not theirs by election and not publicly accountable. With me to discuss the issue of monarchy versus democracy is Andrew McKinley, the Labour MP for Thurrock and a supporter of the campaign for an elected head of state. Welcome, Andrew.
Yeah,
I'd like to start by asking you simply, what's wrong with monarchy?
Well, if we assume that the head of state is a great honour and has some leadership role, then I think that should be selected by the people, not done by accident of birth. And it does seem to me to be absurd that in a modern democracy, somehow your head of state is there by a sheer fluke and or exclusive to a particular family. There's no logic. But of course also in the United Kingdom there are some residual powers which might not be exercised very often or controversially, but they do exist. And in my view, if and when those powers are exercised, they should be done by somebody who has a mandate.
I mean, what kind of alternative system would you like to see?
Well, I think that is part of the problem we saw in Australia. In fact, that I think generally recognised as a majority for a republic, but was finding agreement as to what the alternative should be. And I want to stress to you, Peter, that this is not a thing I lie awake at night thinking about. There are more important things for me to be exercised about, but I do think about it. Also, I recognise, as at this day, there's probably a majority of people in favour of the monarchy institutions, but I still think it's wrong. And therefore, I think we should be looking for ways of electing our head of state. That could be done by a direct election. It could exclude politicians or mean that it can only be a politician who's coming to the end of their public life. It could or should be an esteemed honour. There are some very successful presidents around the world who perhaps do one term. You don't have to look far. I think that the current president of the Irish Republic, Mary McAleese, and her predecessor, another woman, have carried out their office with great dignity. They've been great ambassadors for their country, and I think they're quite a good model or success for that kind of institution. It doesn't have to be an executive president, and they are elected by popular vote.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an important point to stress that they're low cost, they don't have any executive powers, they're purely ceremonial, but they are elected by and accountable by the people.
Also, they don't have a family, or they don't have a family in the sense of the royal family, or what we're told the Queen refers to as the firm. Now, I find it odd that not only is my head of state selected by this hereditary principle, but her son becomes ipso facto the equivalent of the vice president. And there's also the wider family, which we fund. And again, it seems to me odd, but I've asked questions as to what are the parameters of the royal family. And not only my questions unwelcome, but the answer varies from time to time when I ask it. There's no quite limits to this. And well, it seems to be bonkers.
It does seem to be that the royal family is surrounded by an awful lot of secrecy and lack of transparency, which we wouldn't have if we had an elected head of state.
Absolutely, absolutely. But in any event, even if I can't persuade viewers that there should be a change immediately, I do argue the case. One, we should know the limits of the immediate royal family. It should be small. Secondly, there should be a budget for the head of state. So the constant argument, which presumably is an irritation to them as it is to me, about who should pay for what, and they have extraordinary tax arrangements, and some things are their personal property and incomes, and some isn't, and some things are paid by the Foreign Office when they go abroad, some is paid by some other means. It's all clouded in mystery, And even if you look at the monarchies elsewhere in Western Europe, there will be a budget for the king or the queen or the Grand Duke as head of state of those countries. They will be properly funded, and that money is clearly defined. In the United Kingdom, it is obscure, to say the least, as to what the funding streams are, what the tax arrangements are, what is their personal property. Again, I come back to the point, surely in a modern-day democracy, that should not prevail.
Now, I take your point that this is perhaps not the most pressing issue of the day in terms of, funding public services and all those other issues that affect people's daily lives. But surely it is part of the ongoing, unfinished democratization, the transition from feudalism to a modern democracy. In many ways, the aristocracy and the monarchy is a residue of that whole process and symbolize the ongoing democratic deficit.
I absolutely agree with you. I mean, I think that there are a number of things which flow from what you put to me. One is actually, I think the United Kingdom, and particularly the England part of the United Kingdom, is very much a class-ridden society still today. And I think this monarchy system encourages it, part of it. I think there's also a degree of deception. You find some very good people, they're intoxicated by the monarchy. They become fawning and obsequious when normally they're not. I'll give you an illustration. I think if you go to most of my political colleagues, my Labour political colleagues, when they're in a Labour Party, they will, some of them will actually knock the monarchy or make funny remarks and so on. And yet, if they receive an invitation to go to Buckingham Palace, I would get killed in the rush standing in front of them. I remember one occasion I was in the House of Commons. The House of Commons was sitting, but it was rather barren. It was empty. And I asked somebody where everyone was, and they said, well, weren't you invited? Well, mercifully, I was not. But apparently they'd all been invited to Buckingham Palace. So all these people who proclaim some cynicism about the system were there. Now, they're good people, but they're intoxicated by the monarchy. And I asked a number of them the following day, and they said, oh, I wanted to see the artwork, and my wife wanted to go, and that sort of thing. Well, I was a bit disappointed, but not surprised, and it encourages this. And if you think, at the time of the Charles and Diana wedding, I mean, where it probably reached its height, and it was like a fairy tale. It was, one of the problems which I think has arisen with some of the disproportionate publicity in the good times for the monarchy is that, I mean, it's almost... I don't want to exaggerate this, but I think one of the 10 commandments is that thou shalt not create gods, as it were, graven images. Well, in a sense, I think it was bordering on the idolatry. I don't think, I don't want to use the 10 commandments very powerfully in this matter, but if you pause and think about it, is that people were beginning to think that this ordinary people of flesh and blood like ourselves had some divine quality.
Well, of course they used to. They used
to
be divine, right?
But you see, we actually haven't moved on very much when you stop and think about it, because many people do think that a member of the royal family and the Queen herself is sort of, anointed by God. Well, actually, I don't think that's true. Just on the Queen, may I go on? I mean, the present Queen, I fully acknowledge that her personal approval rating is extraordinarily high. It's what people who are elected would give their right hand for. But it is personal to her. It is hardly surprising that somebody who has given good public service since 1952, and over, if you take the great sweep of time, has had very good press. And she's worked hard. This is not personal against her. I acknowledge that she's given good and faithful service. But it is personal to her. It will not, that affection, that special loyalty will not and cannot reside in her son or other members of the royal family. It's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think you've made a very good point about the monarchy symbolising deference and the still class-ridden nature of our society. And I think that, for me anyway, one of the big issues is, of course, the way in which this reinforces a system based on status and elitism. And in a democratic, meritocratic culture, surely we ought to have, if you like, at the acme of our society, someone who represents that democracy and that meritocracy. And you can't have it when the head of state is inherited and when it's restricted to one particular family.
Yes, and also it is discriminatory on a number of grounds, but let me raise two of them. One is religious faith. So here, not just in a multicultural society, but where there's multi-faith or no faith, the head of state under our present constitution can't be anything other than a member of the Church of England. Now, I find that really aggravating and offensive, but it's certainly aggravating.
So you're saying that an atheist or Hindu or a Muslim could never be head of state?
Or a Catholic. I happen to be a Catholic, but I mean, they can't be. And they actually couldn't convert. And they couldn't come out and say, I'm an atheist. They couldn't do that. There would be a major crisis, I assume. But the other thing is it discriminates against women, because although the present head of state is a woman, had George VI and the Queen Mother, if they had had another child, perhaps the third child, who was a boy, he would now be on the throne. It's called the male primogeniture rule. Now, say it didn't happen, but it could have done. And well, I'm opposed to the monarchy system, but I say to folk who do support the monarchy system, don't you even think that's wrong? Shouldn't, if you believe in the hereditary principle, why do you discriminate against women and the hereditary principle?
It's not just that, of course, because, the head of state derives from this single white family. A black Briton could never be our head of state. And that's discrimination. Not by intention, but by default.
The point is that it comes back to this absurd hereditary principle that you're going to be somebody who will at least profess to be not just a Christian, but that they've got to be a Christian. Two, they've got to be a member of the Church of England. They're going to be male unless there is no male issue in that immediate family. So the present Queen would not be Queen if she'd had a younger brother.
And they're going to be white.
Well, indeed they are. Yes, absolutely.
So no black or Asian person, kind of the present setup, ever be our head of state.
Presumably not. I mean, one of the interesting things about this thing is that the hereditary principle, and people think, let's pause for a moment. Perhaps there might be some people watching this who think that there is a degree of divinity, all right? But it presupposes that every stage, as you go down the kings and queens, that there's legitimacy in the sense that nobody has been conceived outside of wedlock, and I think that's stretching credulity to the limits. I mean, if we go back, I'm not talking about, just for the record, I'm not talking about the present royal family or the one just before, but if we just let's go back to Queen Victoria or just before that, are you saying that in every case that people really have been legitimate? Well, what a remarkable family. Probably the real legitimate head of state on this principle is probably a sheep farmer in Bavaria, up a mountainside. I don't know.
Could well be. It does strike me that under the monarchical system, even the most corrupt, lazy, immoral royal has more right to be head of state than the wisest, most moral, most conscientious commoner.
Well, good point, because actually, and I'd like to talk to this, I think you can have a king who's very good. In fact, I can name some. And actually, the Queen's father, George VI, he and his spouse did very well for the United Kingdom during World War II. They were not intended, it was not intended that they should be head of state, or he should be head of state. It was his brother, who actually I think was rather a bad egg. He flirted with the Nazis. During World War II, there's an awful lot of evidence, and there are documents which are suppressed. But I think most people recognise that he was actually in communication with the Nazis, hoping for a restitution to the throne if they could have had a fall of the coalition government. We'd had to come to terms with Hitler and the Nazis. Edward VIII, or the Duke of Windsor, was a thoroughly bad egg. So the system doesn't throw up, as you would inevitably, it doesn't always throw up good people. It throws up some bad ones. And I think he was a baddie. Mercifully, actually, he was eased out, perhaps for the wrong, or least important reasons, that is of marrying an American divorcee. But he was eased out, but he was really, I think, quite a dreadful monarch, would have been. A man not of principle, a man who had quite extreme right-wing views, was not only disloyal to the United Kingdom, but disloyal to his own brother who succeeded him, George VI, for whom I would give some regard. And I say, of course, the system can throw up good people. George VI, not a bad egg.
So the point you're saying is if we didn't have it with Edward, we would have been stuck with him.
Absolutely.
Because the monarchical system has no accountability, no possibility of change.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I don't exaggerate, there were documents in 1945 which were seized because they were acutely embarrassing in relation to Edward VIII and embarrassed the institution and would have embarrassed his good brother, George VI. You remember Anthony Blunt. Now, I don't know if you've ever asked yourself, how was it Anthony Blunt, when they knew he was a Russian spy, a traitor, and had a knighthood, why he wasn't exposed? He wasn't exposed because literally not literally, I was going to say he knew where the bodies were buried. He certainly knows where the documents were buried because he was sent in 1945 as on a personal mission by the royal family to get the documents from a castle in Germany, which caused incrimination and embarrassment in relation to Edward VIII, Duke of Windsor. And
those documents are still under wraps?
Absolutely.
Is there any prospect the public will ever be able to have access to them?
No. The documents were taken to the royal household, so I don't think they were in the custody of the Public Records Office anyway. But I think there are, from what I can ascertain, there are some other records which are on you've heard of the 30-year rule and Freedom of Information Act. Well, these are kicked into touch. They're not available for decades to come. We'd hope that some more documents will be released following the death of the Queen Mother, but because of the view was that some were being sort of kept under drapes out of deference to her. Not that she was in any way necessarily embarrassed by them. I've already indicated to you.
She was pretty right-wing as well.
Well, maybe, but in terms of public office, I'm prepared to acknowledge that her and her husband gave public service and did it diligently and did not seek that office. But this whole painful period for that royal family in 1936 relating to Edward VIII, Duke of Windsor, the abdication, and his shenanigans leading up to World War II and during World War II were deemed to be somewhat painful and embarrassing for the royal family, and particularly to the Queen Mother. So the suggestion was that they were under drapes till she passed on. Well, these documents are still not available.
And it does, once again, reinforce the lack of transparency and accountability when it comes to the royal family.
Correct.
In a way that wouldn't apply if we had an elected head of state, that they would have the proper mechanisms for public scrutiny.
Yes, and they're not subject to any disclosure. And as I say, there are royal household records which aren't in the Public Records Office in Kew.
Yeah, I suppose it also relates to the issue of just the public access to the palaces and the treasures within them. The Royal Art Collection is probably one of the greatest in the world, yet most of it is not open and available to the public. Why not?
Well, in fact, as you know, the limited access to Buckingham Palace has only become available as a consequence directly of the Windsor Castle fire, because it was made clear to the royal family that some of the restitution of that property needed to be met from other sources other than directly from the taxpayer. A lot was done from the taxpayer. So I think the view is that rather grudgingly, but even if I'm wrong, perhaps grudging if I'm wrong, the point is it was only the access to some of the great treasures of Buckingham Palace was only done as a consequence of raising revenue to help pay for the damage at Windsor Castle. It wasn't...
But even so, something like, is it 80 or 90% of the royal collection is not on public view?
Absolutely.
And surely...
And it raises the question whose property it is. In other countries around the world, including some monarchies, that would be deemed to be state property.
Absolutely. I mean, it would be a fantastic gesture for this royal art collection to be made available and dispersed to local galleries around the country. I mean, why bury it away in the dungeons of Buckingham Palace when, you know, the Sheffield Art Gallery, the Manchester Art Gallery and so on could all benefit from the display of these magnificent treasures?
Well, good point, and actually we might test it, because if you have me back again some weeks or months down the road, in the meantime I might put down some questions about the Royal Art Gallery, its numbers, its availability, its location, the opportunities of it being displayed elsewhere around the United Kingdom, and we'll see what replies I get. But I'm not optimistic, and that's why I hint I'd like to come back, because I don't think that they will be prepared to answer parliamentary questions relating to what is deemed to be the personal property of the Queen.
And you're questioning whether it is in fact the personal property of the Queen?
Precisely.
I mean, on what basis do you question their right to hold it as their personal property?
Well, I mean, we're not peculiar, as it were, and other states would have vast works of art and so on, and they may have come down from King Leopold this or Kaiser William that, but they would be deemed to be state property. I mean, there's a degree of logic there.
And a lot of it has been acquired in their capacities as heads of state.
Absolutely.
Yes.
But actually, the other reason why I mentioned parliamentary questions is that it's extraordinarily difficult in this great democracy to have questions accepted in Parliament relating to the monarchy. And when I've succeeded in that, that's only the first hurdle I got over. So I have to get through some rules which narrow my scope for asking questions about the royal family.
What kind of rules?
And then, if I get the question tabled, they might decline to answer it. I've asked in the past about funding, and on some occasions that declined. I mean, I've found ways around this. So, I mean, I see it as a challenge. But
it's incredibly offensive.
Even
that
questions
you as a
like
legitimate parliamentarian.
Well, the questions about the nature, the parameters of the royal family and what constitutes it. That's one which in the past I've been kicked back on, but I've had succeeded subsequently. I mean, I don't give up. I think that I may well have problems regards the art and other treasures to which you and I have been discussing the past few moments. We'll test that. But no, there's still this deference, you know, about the royal family. And I did have some years ago when John Major was Prime Minister, I was asking about morganatic marriages. And there was initially a resistance to that. Eventually, I was able to
explain what a morganatic marriage is.
Well, a morganatic marriage is where the head of state, or the crown prince, or the person who's going to succeed, he or she has a married partner who does not automatically become queen on succession. Now, why this is interesting is that Edward VIII in 1936 asked Stanley Baldwin if he could have a morganatic marriage. That was that he would remain king, but he would marry Wallis Simpson, but she would not become queen. Stanley Baldwin said, there is no such thing in our constitution as a morganatic marriage, and he was supported in that by Clement Attlee on behalf of the Labour Party and Sir Archibald Sinclair on behalf of the Liberal Party. So Parliament spoke, there is no such thing as a morganatic marriage, and he was also, just to complete the picture, supported by the Dominion Prime Ministers, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and so on. And therefore, by convention, it was made clear there was no morganatic marriage. More recently, as you know, Prince Charles has decided to marry Camilla Parker Bowles. The Clarence House spin was that she would not become the Princess of Wales, And the inference was that when he becomes king, she will not become queen. That wasn't my spin, that was theirs. But I immediately rumbled the fact they were trying to pull the wool over the eyes of not just people like myself, but also monarchists who are uncomfortable with this. And then I did succeed on that occasion. I asked, is the proposed marriage of Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles a morganatic marriage? And to the horror of Clarence House, the reply came back no. So what he was trying to do, he was trying to bounce us, he was trying to alter the Constitution. Let me make it clear to you, I believe in a modern day democracy. Prince Charles or anybody else should be able to marry whoever they want. But what I do object to is the Constitution either being altered by stealth or to suit the interests of one man. If you're going to alter the Constitution, by all means, alter it so Prince Charles or anybody else can marry a divorcee, but also alter it so he can be a Catholic, a Protestant, a Jew, or an atheist, or whatever. Alter it so there's not discrimination against women. I want a package of alterations. I would like to see an elected head of state. If I can't have that, I want to see, quotes, a modernisation of the current institutions. You don't alter it for one man to suit his own interests. And the point I have made is the Constitution is not in doubt. The constitutional position was laid down and defined in 1936 at the time of the abdication.
Okay, Andrew, well, I think we'll finish it there. And thank you very much. You've obviously raised a whole package of issues. And as we know, the royal family is a soap opera. It will run and run, and so will the debate about its democracy or lack of it. Thank you for joining us, and please join us next week for another edition of Talking with Tatchell.